The dead body, catalyst of countless detective thrillers and police procedural novels, lying there on the floor all forlorn, yet given some humanity by writers like Patricia Cornwell, whose pathologist case Garpata managed to make the dead speak through probing their story and life. And then there are authors like the Norwegian Karen Fossum, who employ dead bodies as a launch pad into the consequences of murder on the living, both examining the crime and punishment guilt of the murderer, but also the effects on the bereaved. Yet what does the dead body mean to society, other than just contributing to the crime statistics? You can tell an awful lot about the state of a society from its murders. In my new novel, An Eye for an Eye for an Eye, I try and move the dead body right into the centre of the spotlight. Main character Simon Morley is blessed, or perhaps cursed, with the paranormal gift of being able to lay his hands on a corpse and receive a vision of the last thing the person saw before death. In the case of murder victims, that affords him a view of the face of their killer, and he's able to download that so that the police are able to clean up the murders. It may not be a case of the whole of a person's life flashing before their eyes immediately prior to death, rather the last few frames of the reel. Throughout his life, Morley has tried to explore both the origin of his gift and just what it can tell him about dying itself. He tries to push on past those last few frames the mind sees before it loses consciousness for good, to determine what happens at the moment of crossing over into death. So part of the book's exploration is to try and offer a tantalising glimpse into how a living, breathing body becomes a corpse. Writing this book was an unusual experience for me. Firstly in the way it came about, and second that it's a genre book when I don't usually write genre. Usually when I write, the central idea or theme of the book comes first, and once that's allied to the narrative voice, then I let it all simmer away in my subconscious for 6 months before sitting down to write. But An Eye for an Eye for an Eye turned out to be exactly the opposite process. I'd finished reading the novel Kraken by China Mieville, and it really annoyed me. It's a book that's both brilliant and sloppy by degrees, and I felt a bit cheated by the end. But that was the only reaction I expected to have, and I assumed that whatever I turned to read next would banish such feelings about it. But in my sleep that night, the subconscious got to work, and I woke up the next morning with an idea for a new book. But this one I didn't let simmer for 6 months. I sat right down and started writing it the same day. There were no notes, no preparation, no research to work from. I just launched straight into it. Now some of the themes, such as the inquiry into death and the type of dystopia, were playing around in my head beforehand, though at that point they weren't attached to any particular project I had in mind. But the central idea of a man who can envision the faces of murderers from laying hands on the corpses of the victims, that's what must have come to me in my sleep and my dreams. It was the central idea that pulled together all the other ideas that had been previously swirling around in my head, and suddenly I had my novel. The plot wasn't developed at all, but that came as I wrote it. This was a very backwards way of working for me, but not knowing where it would all end up was very liberating, and I could really enjoy the journey, and I hope that's the same for the reader too. I don't really like the idea of differing literary genres. It seems unnecessarily divisive and exclusive to me. Margaret Atwood and William Burroughs both employed science fiction tropes in their literary works, but no one would really call them genre writers or science fiction writers. And no one would ever call Jane Austen a chick lit writer. In my mind, it's all just fiction. But I was struck by reading an article where China Mieville fans were aggrieved that he was never put forward for the literary prizes, because he was regarded as a genre writer. And that's why I started reading him in the first place, to see what the argument was all about. And his advocates were right. Mieville is a highly literary writer who just happens to write fantasy and science fiction. Books like Embassy Town and The City in the City are elegant literary narratives with a high value placed on language and concept, which is one of the main distinctions of literary works. But unfortunately, Kraken was one of his first books that I read, and as I said, it's an ill-disciplined work, and it irked me considerably and subconsciously must have moved me away from the argument that genre writers could write literary books, because it was that irritation that fuelled my novel as I sat down to write it. I wanted to write a genre book that was also an anti-genre book at the same time, and yes, it would have high literary values of language and imagery. So, An Eye for an Eye for an Eye is a police procedural in which the main crime fighter is not actually a policeman at all. And he may well possess the hard-drinking trait so beloved of detective novels, but here it's interrogated both as to the origins of his relationship to alcohol, but it's also used in an ingenious way as part of the plot itself. So the book is a police procedural about the end of police procedure, since long and patiently established approaches to collecting and analysing evidence have been scrapped, due to Morley's unique gift cutting right across the need for any deductive work. The novel also has paranormal elements, in the nature of the third eye gift of Morley and the telepathic powers of his adversary. And yet such powers are probed for their possible or perhaps likely roots in the human brain and the nature of such delusions. And the book fits in the dystopian genre too, only here the roots of the dystopia are traced very clearly to our own economic and political situation and offered up as a none too far extension of our current trends. This is a dystopia not of a repressive regime, but one born out of apathy and drift that snaps human bonds. The political analysis is directly related back to our own politics. Dystopias. Repressive government regimes, possibly an environmental disaster overlaying the awfulness of existence. Neither form the dystopia in my book, as the dystopian conditions arise more from a lack of power and authority at the heart of a society, and people falling back on their predatory, baser instincts. My vision for such a state of affairs was formed simply by considering the current economic malaise that's hit Europe, and in particular the effect on countries like Greece and Spain. I just thought about what would happen if the crisis deepened to the next level, so that governments had to cut so far and so deep that citizens would ask themselves what value there was in still allying themselves to the country, if the government provided no services for them whatsoever. And that would include a lack of security provision from both crime and foreign powers. In such a scenario, people might not see themselves anymore as citizens and would pursue their own goals and ambitions as individuals. Society would break down because neither the government nor the citizens would be holding it together through any collective behaviour. That was something I wanted to explore in a novel. What happens when there are few or no bonds remaining to hold a society together? When everyone is cut adrift and the notion of society itself probably doesn't even exist in any meaningful way? How do traditional behaviours, and in particular those formerly backed by rules which no longer hold, change? And in particular, I wanted to look at what happened when good, solid methods of policing and detection were simply discarded for a quick-hit solution. What would happen within that micro-world of law and authority? What new behaviours would replace in men now stripped of their authority as the guardians of law and order?